Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I'm really excited about this next series featuring the New Visions Honor award-winning book, Black Was the Ink by Michelle Coles. I learned so much from this book. My head is still spinning with it all. First, we'll talk about the summary. So, Black Was the Ink follows main character Malcolm Williams after he is sent to his father's farm in Mississippi from Washington, D.C. after being caught in the crossfire of a gang-related shooting that led to him being harassed by the police. He's angry, and at every turn it just seems like nothing good is ever going to happen for him and Black folks in America in general. Things go from bad to worse when his great aunt Carol tells him that the state is acquiring the family farm to expand a highway through eminent domain. At first, he believes it isn't his problem, but a trip to the farmhouse attic leads Malcolm to the diary of Cedric Johnson, his ancestor who homesteaded the farm, which becomes a figurative and literal gateway to the past. After meeting Cedric's ghost, he starts being sent back to the time of Reconstruction, which is essentially the first civil rights movement in America. Moving between the past and present, he learns much more about landmark cases and political action of Reconstruction that for a brief period of time worked to establish equal rights for Black folks under the law. He sees the effects of their squashing in his present time because those landmark cases and those foundational political moves were squashed by white supremacy movements. And so he sees how all of this from the past is connected to his present day. And even though his Aunt Carol tells him to leave it be, Malcolm applies what he learns and he tries to figure out how to save his family farm. Will he be able to? You'll have to read it to find out. So, you know I love first pages. Here is the first page of Black Was the Ink, so you can get a good idea about what the writing's like. Malcolm fell for an eternity before landing with a thud on his back, his arms stretched out in a snow angel and his stomach in his throat. He gingerly peeled his fingers off the cold, hard ground and checked his body for broken bones. Surprisingly, he was fine. He stood up and felt his way around the dark, cavernous space, searching for a door, a light, anything to let him know where he was. He couldn't see a thing, but the stench was overwhelming. Malcolm covered his nose and stumbled forward, banging into a wall. He felt along the wall's hard-ribbed surface, looking for a way out. His fingers found a metal latch. Relieved, he lifted it. A door swung open, and he was momentarily blinded by a burst of sunlight. Malcolm felt disoriented. He gave his eyes a second to adjust and then stepped forward onto a step, then another, then down onto the dusty ground. Malcolm turned about to see he had just stepped out of a rusted-out train car. He had never seen a train like it. Suddenly, a pot-bellied pig charged past him, kicking mud and muck onto his clothes, spinning him around. A short old man with dark, sun-withered skin, wearing a straw hat and brown cotton overalls, soon followed, chasing after the pig at full speed, cursing the whole way. Across the road, people scurried in and out of a barn tucked into a dense cluster of trees. Malcolm could see a white dome above the trees that reminded him of something, but his memory failed him. Malcolm felt a push from behind. A tall, middle-aged, light-skinned black man stood at the top of the twin-car steps Malcolm had just descended. The man had broad shoulders and a full beard that grew all the way back to his ears, yet he had no mustache. He wore a three-piece blue cotton suit held by suspenders with a white pleated shirt underneath and a red silk handkerchief folded into the front jacket pocket. He tapped Malcolm's hip with a knobby cane. "Come on, Cedric. You've stood there gawking long enough. Now let me through," the man said, nudging Malcolm again. "Don't forget my bag," he called, pushing his way past him. "Who's Cedric?" Malcolm looked around. He felt confused, dizzy, and nauseous. He slapped his face to see if he was awake and immediately felt the sting. He glanced down to find he was wearing a tattered brown suit and homemade leather boots. Looking back up, he caught his reflection in the open train door's glass window. The person peering back was not Malcolm, similar in appearance, but not him. He looked about Malcolm's age, 16, and had Malcolm's same tall, lean frame, ruddy brown skin, and embarrassingly long eyelashes. He even had the same chin dimple, but his hair was off. Way off. It was cut short and featured a strange side part instead of Malcolm's tightly coiled jet black hair, usually worn in braids or in a loose crown on top of his head. Most disturbing was his super weird caterpillar thick mustache that twisted up at the ends like an actor in an old movie. Where am I? Malcolm wondered. He grabbed the side of the train and braced himself, no longer able to suppress the gush of vomit that flew from his body. Then in a blink he was in bed with his head resting on a sketch pad, pen still in hand. So, there is the first page. Well, the first 2 pages anyways. In her author note, Coles talks about how she started Black Was the Ink because of her frustration with the lack of racial progress in the U.S., especially after the mass shooting of Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. She writes, "At the time, I was on maternity leave with my son, whose middle name happened to be Emmanuel. As I stared into my babe's innocent face, I struggled with how to prepare him for a world filled with so much inexplicable hatred toward people who look like him. After that latest hate crime, she began looking into the church's history and was struck by the parallels between the time of Reconstruction and present day. Even though a lot of hard work went into burying and shifting the story of Reconstruction as a foundation for much of the injustice that exists today, Coles hopes that this book reveals, quote, the good that the first Black congressmen and their white allies accomplished, and that can be a way to fight back against that injustice." Now for some analysis. The concept for this story reminded me of Octavia Butler's Kindred, so fans of that story, which is fantastic, by the way, might be interested in this one. Coles is a civil rights attorney, and it shows. She really flexes that muscle and her knowledge of the law and legal structures through the story. The research was so well done. I learned so many things that I didn't have any clue about at all, and it felt super overwhelming to me at first. There were several times I had to put the book down to process what was happening and what I was learning before I could come back to the text. At first, there was so much happening in this book that it sort of felt like a criticism, and I even considered whether or not the book could have been broken up a bit and made into a series. But upon further reflection and further reconsideration, I think it makes sense to make this book overwhelming. Structural inequity and racism is overwhelming, and it's a lot for the folks who experience the negative consequences of those structures. And Malcolm describes this several times, how heavy they are and how tired and angry they make him. So now I think it's actually a really brilliant example of how form can reflect content. If I listed everything I didn't know about before reading this book, but learned while reading it, I'd give so much away from the book, but I wanted to at least give a shortened list. So here's some things that I didn't know that I did know after reading this book. 1, Black folks served in Congress and the Senate long before I thought they did. 2, there were more massacres than I knew about. Like massacres that had names to them. Not even counting just sort of like, massacres that got left out of the history books. 3, why isn't there a movie about Robert Smalls? Like, that dude was incredible. 4, there are really good examples of white allyship during Reconstruction, and I didn't know about any of them. And 5, this is the last one on this list, there are also solid examples of how unjust our systems of government can be and are, and they're super scary relevant to our current time period. I connected so deeply to the potential loss of the family farm through eminent domain. My Mamaw's folks, though white but poor, lost theirs to the water company in the same way. And my Mama is still super mad about it because they never did anything with it. It's just ruinous right now, being reclaimed by nature. They're building pretty expensive houses in the surrounding area, but for her particular homestead, where their house was, they're not doing anything with it, and haven't since she was, in elementary school. There are other scary parallels to today, like President Grant fortifying DC and expecting an insurrection, SCOTUS overturning legislation that had made people free, decision-making bodies purposefully stacking against equity, etc. So what I think that this book showcases in terms of thinking about place is how time is a major factor in that. We don't often consider that relationship, that time is an important element of place, and I think this book illustrates that in spades. Because there were so many connections to things that are currently happening in our own cultural moment, I want to leave us with a couple of quotes from the book that gave me some hope. On page 267, Benjamin Butler, a white ally of this time, is talking, and he says, "You know how many times I've been told since the end of the Civil War that by doing justice to the Negro we shall pull down the pillars of our political temple and bury ourselves in the ruins. When we were abolishing slavery by adopting the 13th Amendment, we were warned that we were bringing measureless calamity upon the Republic. Did it come? When the 14th Amendment was passed, the same wail of the fearfulness and unbelieving was heard. Again, when it was proposed to elevate the Negro to citizenship, to give him the ballot as his weapon of self-defense, we were told that the cup of our destruction was filled to its brim." Then he laughed out loud at the absurdity. "Well, thankfully," he said, "I have lived long enough to learn that in the long run, it's safest for a nation, a political party, or an individual man to dare to do right and let the consequences take care of themselves." To dare to do right. I love that. And then when governing bodies don't dare to do right, I found these words helpful. "Gentlemen," says Senator Bruce, "it's going to be what it's going to be. Until then, we just have to focus on what we can do to make a difference in the lives of our people." This is such an important book, especially with all of the modern day parallels to Reconstruction and the fact that I didn't know about any of it. I really can't recommend it enough. Like I said, there's a lot in there. At times it can feel really overwhelming, but I learned so much that I highly recommend it. So that's it for this time. Stay tuned. Our next episode will detail some potential teaching ideas from a critical rule perspective. Until then, y'all come back now, would you?